Hey everybody. One of the things that I love about teaching is the great questions that I get from my students. It's these questions that I get from my students that cause me to have to think more carefully and also remember that when I'm teaching, there are students that are paying attention, that are thinking through the ideas that are being presented, that are wrestling with opposing views on certain issues. And the other night, when I was teaching one of my classes, I got an excellent question from one of my students. Now, this student has told me that he would consider himself an agnostic, and so he doesn't consider himself a Christian, but also doesn't consider himself antagonistic towards it. He just hasn't made up his mind yet. And throughout the class, at some point I made reference to the Christian view of morality, and so he stuck around afterwards and asked me this. He says that he oftentimes hears Christians talk about how without God there is no morality, and so he asked me to just consider a world in which intelligent beings like humans, alright? So essentially humans in a world in which God does not exist. He says, can't you see them possibly coming up with some kind of moral system so that they can get along? He said, for example, isn't it possible that I don't steal from my neighbor because I don't want my neighbor to steal from me, and my neighbor doesn't steal from me because they don't want me to steal from them. And so you have this kind of general agreement in community as to why we treat each other in certain ways. And so I said, for the sake of argument, if we did have a world in which God does not exist, I can see intelligent beings developing some kind of system so that they can coexist a little more efficiently. I don't have a problem with that. I don't see that as too far-fetched. Right? I could definitely see that happening. But the issue is that even within that system, that morality is not objective. That morality is subjective. It can easily be shifting and moving. It can change over time. Some things that were considered moral in one day could equally be considered immoral in another. And you couldn't say that what they used to do was immoral, because it was considered moral at the time. So, for example, the issue of slavery. In the United States, we have a terrible past. This is kind of the really bad track record that we have in this country of having had slavery for as long as we did, and constantly compromising as opposed to standing up against the evils of slavery. But see, from a perspective that says there's an objective standard of morality, we can actually look back and say that was wrong. Even if the majority of the people thought that it was okay. Even if the majority of people thought there was nothing morally wrong with slavery, we can look back and say, regardless of their opinion, independent of their opinion, it was wrong. Southern slavery was immoral. But if you believe that it's the community, the society that determines what is right and wrong, you would have to say, no, there was nothing wrong with what they were doing. It only became wrong later. And I think that's very problematic. It's very problematic because I think that we know that treating humans the way that many African Americans were treated in the South during the time of slavery is wrong, but was wrong in that very moment, regardless of what people thought. But I think his question stemmed from a misunderstanding of the moral argument. And I see this misunderstanding over and over and over again. Not too long, Prager University released a video on morality, where they essentially make a kind of moral argument. And I saw some of the atheist response videos to it. And I felt that this mistake was being made over and over and over again. And that is confusing what the argument is actually saying. You see, the moral argument for God's existence is typically formulated something like, if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. You see, it doesn't say anything about belief in God. It doesn't say that in order to be moral, you must believe in God. That's not what the argument is making. And so, to try and refute the moral argument, or a video like Prager University's video on morality, by simply stating that atheists do good things, is to miss the argument completely. And this is an issue that continues to come up. In fact, I remember the late Christopher Hitchens was debating a Christian apologist. And when the Christian apologist brought up the moral argument for God's existence, Christopher Hitchens' response was, name one thing that a Christian can do that an atheist cannot. Name one moral thing that a Christian can do that an atheist cannot. Christopher Hitchens was a brilliant man, a great communicator, and yet even he misunderstood the essence of the argument. You see, the argument is not, if you believe in God, you can be moral. If you don't believe in God, you can't. The argument is, if God exists, then objective morality is on the table for all. But if God does not exist, objective morality is off the table for all. So can we be good without God? Well, it depends. What do you mean? Do you mean, can we do good things apart from a belief in God? Sure, we see that happen all the time. But can we do something that is objectively good if God does not exist? The answer to that is no. And if you want to disagree with that, what you need to do is be able to lay out an objective grounding for morality. You see, like my student, oftentimes when we're trying to establish some kind of grounding for morality apart from God's existence, we immediately go to something like agreement amongst the community. But see, while it may be true that communities will naturally come to some kind of agreement as to how we should behave in order to survive, in order to flourish, that does not put a moral obligation on any individual. You see, because all you can say is, well, the community doesn't like for certain people to behave in a certain way. Okay, so what? So what? Morality ends up being a matter of preference. And that puts no moral obligation on any individual. So it may be true that we don't steal because we don't want to be stolen from. That's possible, sure. But all that does is describes what we do. It does not prescribe anything. It does not put any moral obligation on us to not steal. It simply explains why many of us choose not to. But you see, an objective moral standard puts an objective obligation, a moral obligation, on the people. And this is what atheism, naturalism, fails to account for. And so again, please, especially to my atheist friends, but also Christians, understand, the claim is not that atheists cannot be moral. That's not what the argument is. The argument is that if God does not exist, we have no grounding for objective morality. And if objective morality does not exist, then there is no objective morality for the theist or the atheist. And that's the point. And so I would encourage you to consider those consequences. Because the reality is, if you really think about it, you know that some things are wrong, regardless of how people feel about them. And so that should cause you to pause and question, what is it that makes it wrong? How can I make the objective claim that something like slavery in the South was actually evil, even when many people believed it was perfectly fine? So I hope this has brought some clarity to the argument. I'd love to know your thoughts. So even if you disagree with me, please comment down below, and I'd be happy to engage in the conversation. I hope this was helpful to some of you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, guys.